So first up this morning, I have Professor Norman Fenton. So Norman is a member of the Heart Group. He's a mathematician by training, a professor of risk at Queen Mary University of London. He's also the director of Agena, a company that specializes in artificial intelligence and Bayesian probabilistic reasoning. Now, Norman, before I say hello, I'm going to say this to every member of Heart that comes on the show. I just want to say thank you for all of the brilliant work that you've done over the last few years, standing up for our rights, me and you and our children and everything else. So thank you, Norman, and hello.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me on.
No, it's an honor to have you on the show, Norman. Thank you very much. Right, I've given a very short, brief introduction to you there, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind just giving a little bit more background information, how you became a professor, what's your background, and why you're qualified to talk about the things you're talking about today.
Well, as you mentioned there, I'm a mathematician, and until I retired last month, as you said, I was a professor of risk in the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Queen Mary. I've published 6 books and over 300 peer-reviewed papers, and I'd like to think that I was quite highly respected in my field, which is largely concerned now with quantifying uncertainty using this thing called Bayesian probability. That was until I started to show in 2020 that the entire COVID narrative was being driven by flawed and easily manipulated statistics. And then I was suddenly called a conspiracy theorist and a spreader of misinformation. And from that point on, all my research papers on the subject were essentially censored, and I was treated like an academic pariah.
Yeah, and there was obviously a leak, wasn't there, within Heart? We don't need to go over it now, but anybody who's interested in finding out about that leak, which it appears to be actually government-supported leak, because the company behind the leak was given over £1 million by the UK government. Craig was on the show last week, and we talked all about that, how that was used to smear Heart, and what a little rubbish it was. So anybody who's interested, go and have a listen to that interview with Claire Craig that I did, I think, last Thursday. Right, Norman, okay, explain to me what Bayesian probabilistic reasoning is.
Well, Bayesian reasoning is based on a theorem called Bayes' theorem, which was named after Thomas Bayes, who was an English Presbyterian minister born in, I think, 1701, who studied problems of statistics and philosophy. And it's actually a simple formula which enables us to calculate how much we should revise our belief, a prior belief in some unknown or uncertain hypothesis, such as, for example, whether a coin is fair after we observe evidence relevant to the hypothesis, such as, for example, the number of heads in a sequence of tosses. So if, say, you observe 9 out of 10 heads in 10 consecutive tosses of a coin, then the probability that the next toss will be a head is actually going to be influenced by how strong your prior belief was about the coin being fair. And what Bayes' theorem enables us to do is calculate that so-called posterior probability of a head that properly takes account of any such prior belief or knowledge together with the evidence that we've observed, which in this case was 9 out of 10 heads. Now, a very good example of Bayesian reasoning is COVID testing. So if you know, for example, that, let's say, a PCR test is generally accurate. Let's say it always tests positive for a person with the virus, but there's only a small chance, say a 1% chance, that a person without the virus wrongly tests positive. Then what's the probability that you've got the virus if you test positive? So we get the evidence that you test positive. There's our evidence. How do we actually work out the probability that you really do have the virus? Now, most people assume the probability is very high because there was, the test always correctly gets a positive result if you've got it, and it's only got this very, very small false positive probability. But actually, it all depends on what you know about the prior probability. So if we know that the population infection rate is currently about 1 in 1,000, then our prior probability for a person having the virus is 1 in 1,000. So let's suppose we test randomly 10,000 people. Then what we know is, because about 1 in 1,000 have the virus, then we know that about 10 of those out of the 10,000 will generally have the virus. Now, they're all going to test positive, right? But that leaves just under 10,000 who don't have the virus. Right? So you've taken away, it's 9,990. And of those, because there's a 1% false positive rate, that means about 100 of those are going to wrongly test positive. So in all, you've now got 110 testing positive, of whom only 10 actually have the virus. So that's actually a less than 10% chance that a person testing positive has the virus. And that's why, if you're testing a lot of asymptomatic people with a PCR test, then even if the PCR test has a very low false positive rate, the vast majority of people who test positive will actually be wrongly classified as COVID cases.
Wow. Do you think when ministers are making decisions, are they aware of this, these kind of statistics, Norman?
They're absolutely unaware of it, and there are lots of statisticians who are actually unaware of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously aware, like a lot of people, of the issues to do with PCR testing, because even those positives can actually be because they're picking up something else which is similar, or maybe even a bit of dead virus. I think there's all those. So if you add that into the mix as well, to the fact of all these false positives, which actually are more than the number of actual captured positives, I mean, this makes a lot of the decisions that ministers have made extremely costly, doesn't it? Because obviously they were telling people to stay at home even if you didn't have any symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, this was of course all driving up this the number of COVID cases, and that was creating the framework for the narrative, for example, for lockdowns, and in particular the second lockdown.
Yeah. Okay. And obviously the modelling that went on with all of this, these numbers, presumably these PCR numbers, were fed into those models as well, weren't they?
Yes, I mean, well, the original models, the imperial models that were predicting the very high case numbers, they didn't actually have at that point much of the detailed information about the PCR test. I mean, originally we didn't realize how inaccurate the PCR tests were. Right at the start of the pandemic, we were actually having papers published. We weren't being censored then because we weren't really challenging the narrative. In fact, we were one of the first to show that the infection fatality rate was lower than was being claimed, primarily because at that point they were only testing people who were seriously ill with symptoms in hospital. And so obviously quite a lot of those people, especially because of the poor health decisions that were being made at that time, a significant number of those people actually died, of course. You had this artificially high infection fatality rate. And we showed that the actual infection rate in the population was we argued it was actually probably higher than was being reported, even whilst the infection fatality rate was lower than was being reported. And we even called at that point for more random testing because we didn't know how inaccurate those tests were.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that, particularly with the modelling, because there should be a review. We should have a national review, I think, in terms of the use of statistics. I'm not sure whether this is part of the big nationwide COVID review, but I think it certainly should be the use of models and statistics during the pandemic, because we've seen some awful uses of data, and particularly with the press. Of course, they get hold of all of this, don't they? And they just think that they'll take modelled numbers as in actual numbers, and they'll talk about things as if it's already happened, when in fact, actually, it's just modelled data. So, Norman, tell us about this Scottish ambulance data and what it shows and how it contradicts to other data in existence in Scotland.
Yeah, so this the Scottish ambulance data since mid-August 2020 showed a significant weekly increase in cardiovascular incidents, which were averaging about 30% higher than the corresponding pre-COVID period of 2018-19. And there were especially large peaks between May and September 2021, which were over 60% higher than the corresponding 2018-19 period. And the youngest were proportionally worse effective. And crucially, there were peaks in serious cardiac incidents occurring shortly after vaccination peaks in each of the different age groups. So why would there be sort of inconsistencies, with other reported data? So first of all, if you base COVID cases on the number of PCR positives rather than on people genuinely ill with symptoms, which is what most governments have been doing, right from the start, then the more people you test, of course, the more cases you find, irrespective of what the true case rate is. And that's why ambulance data and emergency calls relating to COVID triage tend to be much more accurate indicators of the true case rate rather than just counting these PCR positives. In fact, before this, we looked at the Scottish ambulance data, we'd already exposed how massively exaggerated the reported case numbers were in England in late 2020 and early 2021 by simply comparing the reported case number trends with the COVID triage ambulance call trends, which used to be posted on the NHS dashboard. It showed a completely different, inconsistent picture with that dashboard.
So I think I jotted down some timelines here. So May to September 2021, we saw some peaks, and you were saying that the youth were affected more than the elderly.
Yeah.
And you were saying that this was happening after, obviously, because by that time we'd sort of rolled out the vaccine to young people. So is this case data or is this something else?
That was the Scotland cardiovascular incidence ambulance data. So these are specific, right. You can actually search the database for specific reasons for the emergency, the ambulance emergency. So you can search by cardiovascular incidence by regions, by each different region. So we looked at all of the different regions and specifically by cardiovascular incidence. And that's where we were comparing, and you compare that. You can see the trends over time. So you can do a direct comparison for the excess numbers compared to the pre-COVID period.
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting, that peak we're talking about, it's a 4 or 5 month, whatever period in 2021 after the vaccine rollout. And we're talking about young people. Now, a lot of people would say, well, COVID gives you heart problems. And I know that Heart have debated this a lot. Has there been any kind of conclusions to this conversation from government about what is causing these spikes?
No, there hasn't, and they've certainly not accepted the link to the vaccine. Now, look, I wouldn't go so far as saying the data provides. Of course, it doesn't prove a causal link to the vaccinations, but this is the whole point about our sort of Bayesian approach, where we can take account of. We don't just do sort of number crunching, because we look at sort of causal explanations of the data, biases, uncertainty about its accuracy, key information that's missing. This is what we do with our sort of Bayesian networks. And from a Bayesian perspective, it does provide quite strong evidence of a link between the vaccine and the excess number of cardiovascular incidents.
Okay, and Heart have had quite a bit to say about this, I think, haven't you? I think you've written letters and you've certainly talked publicly about this. Have you had any response from the government at all, or anyone in officialdom?
I mean, all of the responses on this are essentially just to dismiss it. The argument is that the rate is very, very similar to the previous base rate, and there's no evidence, they claim, that the vaccines are anything other than safe and effective. I mean, that safe and effective narrative, which people claim, this is what people have been saying within our kind of group, with our sort of circle, sort of, you could call them COVID skeptics, people have been claiming that safe and effective narrative is crumbling. As far as the mainstream media are concerned, they might be having a few extra stories. You might be seeing the odd story about, vaccination injury or death, but it's always couched in the language of very, very rare, and it doesn't provide evidence that the vaccines are anything other than safe and effective. It's what you get all the time. Yeah,
I do wonder what I'd love to have if we could do a nationwide poll on this, because, the mainstream media will carry on with their narrative until it absolutely breaks. They don't give in easily. It was the same with Joe Biden saying, if you get the vaccine, you won't get COVID. Now, that only crumbled, and Bill Gates and all the like admitted that it didn't stop transmission once the memes and the Mickey taken had just got so extreme, because, everybody who's taken a vaccine, right, has already got COVID, and they're going, well, that just clearly, and then these memes started. I do wonder if we are near that point now, and most people, even if they may not have made their mind up totally, will have heard. They're bound to have heard now. We've been making so much noise over the past few years. So I do wonder if we are close to that point now where the majority of the public know there's something up, but the mainstream media hasn't acknowledged yet. I hope that's where we are. Right. Let's talk about the ONS as well and their mortality data via vaccination status, because there's serious problems with that data, or there's certainly serious questions of that data, isn't there, Norman?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that data is important because in theory, if it was accurate, we should be able to use it to get a truly objective assessment of the safety and effectiveness of the vaccines by focusing only on the comparison of all-cause mortality between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. So let's put this simply. If COVID is as dangerous as claimed, and if the vaccine is as effective as claimed, then there should be a lot less COVID deaths amongst the vaccinated than the unvaccinated. And on the other hand, if the vaccine is as safe as claimed, then there should be none or very few more non-COVID deaths amongst the vaccinated through adverse reactions. So the net effect is that all-cause mortality in the vaccinated should be lower. And focusing on all-cause mortality also avoids all the problems with the definitions of what constitutes a COVID case.
Yeah, and of course, just to add a nuance to that, Norm, which I know that you'll be thinking of, you're saying that obviously we need to then compare age groups with and you need to be age standardized essentially, because I have seen commentators before just compare numbers with numbers, and of course it all depends on, the assumption is older people are more likely to be more vaccinated than younger people, so you do need to go that step further and age standardize the data. So go on.
Yeah, so now right from the start, when the ONS first published the data, it was clear there were flaws in it. Now at this point, I want to give specific recognition. This is not just me who did this work. We've been doing this work, analysing this data for a long time. It's people like Martin Neal, colleagues like Martin Neal, Scott McLachlan, Claire Craig, Jonathan Engler, Joel Smalley, Josh Gatescoff, Danny Emmett, Jessica Rose, and others who have to remain anonymous. So I wanted to get a sort of a plug in for those people. But while superficially, what we saw was that superficially it was showing originally a lower all-cause mortality rate in the vaccinated. But the problem was we found these sharp peaks in non-COVID mortality in the unvaccinated in each of the different age groups shortly after the vaccine rollout for those age groups, shortly after the vaccine rollout peaked. And that would mean that by not taking the vaccine, the unvaccinated were somehow suddenly dying of things other than COVID, which is completely illogical. And also at the same time, we were seeing that the vaccinated were seeing a miraculous drop in non-COVID mortality deaths, sort of suggesting that the vaccine had some sort of magical all cure, properties for all other diseases. So we actually showed that the peaks like that are actually the inevitable result of just misclassifying deaths shortly after vaccination as unclassified deaths. And we also showed that the ONS data was using an artificially low estimate of the proportion of unvaccinated in the population. And the effect of this is to wrongly increase the death rate of the unvaccinated and reduce the death rate of the vaccinated. So it was completely biasing the results.
Yeah, now to play devil's advocate, and I know that there is an effect called the healthy vaccine effect. And basically that's where you have the fact that vaccinated populations tend to be healthier than unvaccinated. Yeah. And there's a good reason for that. It's because if you're very, very unwell, particularly if you're near death, then actually giving you a vaccine is too risky. Now, I remember I've talked to epidemiologists about this, and there is a real thing there, but these numbers are quite striking in the data, aren't they? Do you think that this healthy vaccine effect can explain these oddities in the data?
Okay, there's been a lot of confusion about what we've said about the healthy vaccine effect. Okay, I mean, there's the healthy vaccine effect, and there's the moribund unvaccinated effect. So here's what we believe is the case, right? Those peaks, which they claim to be the the moribund unvaccinated effect, the idea that, people close to death when they're rolling out the vaccine are not going to get vaccinated. There's no case for that either theoretically or empirically, because in the UK, people who are close to death or people with very, very major comorbidities and likely to die soon, they were actually prioritized for the vaccine, right? That's the first thing. There might have been a very small number who weren't, but that doesn't explain those peaks. And what's more, you can't even simulate that kind of peaks throughout the year, because there will be people, close to death and being refused the vaccine all the time. Why is it just at the point of the vaccine rollout, right? That's one thing. But the second thing, which is incredibly important, is that we believe there is a generally healthy vaccine effect, a steady one, which is a consistent bias, which means that, yes, there is, we believe that people are wealthier, that seems to be the more educated, the ones who, for some reason, were more likely to take the vaccine. And so there is a systemic bias. And the key thing is, the ONS never adjusted for that bias. So whether it's the healthy vaccinee bias or something else, it doesn't matter. In the end, it doesn't matter. It means the results were biased in favor of the vaccine, and that's a bias that they never adjusted for.
Well, that's okay, though, as long as it's biased towards the vaccine. Exactly. That's what the government would say. And and listen, I've spoken to people in the NHS about this, people who are actually on the front line of care, and they've said, well, hang on a second, they raised exactly the same point as you. We were vaccinating anything that moved, essentially. So yep. they've even questioned, without looking, at the big picture statistics and whatever, they've said that straight off to me, that hang on, I know people that have had strokes that we vaccinated and whatnot. So I have got big question marks over that. Yeah. But it was used to muddy the waters over this debate. Now, the next one I think is incredibly important. How many people are unvaccinated in the UK, Norman? Tell us all the problems and issues around what seems like quite a simple question.
Okay, so the ONS in May of 2022, the last report they published was on this mortality data by vaccination status was July of 2022, and it dated up to the end of May 2022. And they were reporting at that point that there were 8% adult unvaccinated in England. Their data's for England. And that was inconsistent with what, for example, the UKHSA were reporting, which was nearer 20% for adult unvaccinated. But interestingly enough, that 8% figure was also very widely quoted. It was the one that was widely publicised in this BBC ridiculous documentary called Unvaccinated. They were using it to show that actually there was this. On the one hand, it was a tiny minority of nutcases, who were unvaccinated. But on the other hand, they were saying there was still even that number we needed to convince that it was the wrong thing not to be vaccinated. So they were stressing this 8% number. Now, in that documentary itself, they actually reported on an ICM survey, which I think had actually been conducted for a Scottish television or something, right? And actually a really, really extensive survey, a very, very good survey of over 2,500 people. And in that, they found 26% unvaccinated. And that survey was highly representative. It matched the ONS data on other sort of population demographics. The only one it didn't match was whether they were vaccinated or not. So the ONS was saying 8%, and this very, very comprehensive and representative sample was saying 26%. Now, whether you're using classical statistics or Bayesian statistics, any way you cut this, there is no way that ONS figure was a correct representation of the proportion of unvaccinated in the population. And there's a very simple reason why it's not. And it's because they were always using a very biased subset of the England population, okay? It only contains people who were registered in the 2011 census and who were also registered with a GP in 2019. And that means there are at least 10 million adults in the UK who were excluded from their subset. And we know for obvious reasons that a far greater proportion of those 10 million, who are kind of like off the system, as it were, would have been unvaccinated than those in the ONS subset. And look, even if we ignore the misclassification problem, and the fact that we all found that a lot of vaccinated deaths were actually also missing completely from the ONS data. Even if we ignore all that, the effect of underestimating the true proportion of unvaccinated is to exaggerate both the efficacy and the safety of the vaccination.
Yeah, and to be fair to ONS, they do in all of their reports, they do point out the fact that there is this problem. And I think they might have even wrote blogs on it, the difference between the NIMS data set, which is used by the UK HSA, versus the census data. So they were clear about that. But the problem is, I think it's actually the UK Statistics Authority have failed to pick up the BBC and to pick up ministers. Now, ministers obviously want to say what a success the vaccine rollout was. 92% of adults have had it. And then, of course, like you said, the problem then becomes is when you start trying to look at the data, particularly when you look at deaths between unvaccinated and vaccinated people, and you see it's all skewed towards vaccinated. Well, people will point and say, well, yeah, of course. Well, there's hardly anyone unvaccinated, is there? And that's the problem we've got. Now, I know that the ONS is due to publish this data, start publishing this data again, aren't they?
Yeah, they're fun enough tomorrow. I think they promised it, after the July report and all of the problems, we were amongst the sort of very prominent for pointing out the problems. They know the problems. We look, the ONS people were actually very good in we were communicating them. They often provided new information, particularly about age categorization that we'd asked for. So they were quite responsive, but they never really, got to grips with this, with some of the more serious problems we pointed out. And so they didn't, after that July 22 report, having published it every other month, for over the previous, 18 months, they suddenly it didn't appear anymore. Finally, they kept saying it was going to come. Finally, apparently it's due out tomorrow. Now, my understanding, they're saying that the reason for the delay is because they're now going to use the new census data, right? Which is, hopefully going to be sort of a more accurate representation. But I would like to point out that in that last report, once you adjusted for all of the biases that I said, there was very, very strong evidence that towards the end, there was actually increasing all-cause mortality in the vaccinated, especially in the younger age group. So I suspect that was the reason, that may have been the reason why they then stopped the reporting from that point on.
Yeah, I did put an FOI on this, and they were a bit naughty because my question is what was the decision? What was behind the decision to stop publishing that data back in July? And they took the full 28 days to come back to me, so dragging their feet. And when they came back, they just said, well, because we're going to start publishing it again next month. So they didn't give me an answer. Now, interestingly, and I don't know whether you followed this, Norman, but excess deaths. So we've obviously got this issue with excess deaths. And the ONS a couple of weeks back wrote a blog. Obviously, there's been a lot of questions in Parliament about this and a lot of pressure on government to hold an investigation. And it seems there's been a response. But the response is that ONS is going to look at how it measures excess deaths. So it's actually going to reclassify them. So I'm not sure we are necessarily moving forward there, but what I will try and do is I will try and get somebody from ONS on the show if they'll come on. Maybe they can give us more information about this. Right, Norman, hearts have obviously been censored a lot, and we've seen an awful lot of censorship of dissenting voices. What's your experience personally from the last couple of years in terms of being censored and cancelled?
Well, as I said, originally when we were writing up our research that wasn't challenging the narrative, we didn't have problems about getting it published. Of course, as I said, I've been very, very widely published before. But as soon as I started highlighting, the flaws with the PCR testing, exaggerated numbers, and in particular, also highlighting flaws in the vaccine's safety and efficacy studies, as well as work on efficacy of early treatments, my papers, all our group's papers, were rejected without review from all the journals we submitted them to, and they were even rejected from the preprint servers like medRxiv and Archive. I was viciously attacked and abused by members of the 77th Brigade, called conspiracy theorists, pusher of fake news, misinformation. People were continually calling for my dismissal from Queen Mary on Twitter and also writing to the college. Obviously, I was shadow banned on Twitter. YouTube instantly removed any video I posted mentioning the vaccination. My Wikipedia page was edited with complete lies. I was shunned by academic colleagues. I was disinvited, for example, from giving a talk at our own medical school. to whom, pre-COVID, I'd given many talks because a lot of my research was in collaboration with clinicians there. I mean, I even had students, it was a group of students, demanding to take an alternative module to mine rather than be taught by me. And I didn't really receive any institutional support against any of these baseless attacks. Now, the thing is, what I'm worried about is that people seem to think that everything has changed now, and that the flaws in the narrative, are being exposed, and that, for example, the lack of safety and efficacy of the vaccines is being openly discussed. But it's absolutely not true. You might be able to say more on Twitter now, but nothing, as we just said before, nothing has really changed about the mainstream. They still insist safe and effective narrative can't be challenged. They still insist that, you can, the vaccines doesn't stop transmission and getting COVID, but it stops hospitalizations and deaths, whereas it clearly doesn't. And you've seen things like the recent dismissal of Mark Stein from GB News because he was openly challenging the narrative. I mean, even more alarming from my perspective is that ResearchGate, which is the only preprint server where we have been allowed to publish our research, are now clamping down. So I was shocked to discover that Dennis Rancor, who had been publishing he publishes high quality empirical research showing international failings of the vaccine. He was personally banned from there. And last week, an important recent paper by his group, in which he was an author, also about the latest, vaccine international safety data, it was actually removed by ResearchGate shortly after being put up.
Yeah, I think, some people will maybe wonder why I'm still banging on about this, and I still ask all of my guests about this, but it has, like you said, it hasn't gone away, has it? And I think, COVID's clearly gone away, but, we do need to keep on going on about this, and we need to exert some pressure, I think, on MPs going forward, because if we have another pandemic or another incident, it doesn't necessarily have to be a pandemic, but any kind of medical incident, then we want to hear the truth from experts, don't we, Norman?
Yeah, but they're not. They're going to roll in the same people who are pushing effectively the agenda sort of 2030 narrative, which is all about, increased control and the move towards digital international passports and all that kind of stuff. Basically COVID lockdowns were always a precursor to climate lockdowns, in my view, anyway.
Yeah. Listen, Norman, we've run out of time, sadly. We had a long list of questions here to go over. We managed to get through some of them, so I hope you'll come back on the show at some point. It's been great speaking with you, and like I said, thank you again for all of the work you and your colleagues have done across the past 3 years. Thank you, Norman. Right, okay, don't go away, because after the break we will have a debate on Scottish independence.